Heyo! It's Maddie. Glad you're back. Lately there's been a lot of shade thrown on housing. Some for good reason. After the huge run we've seen in prices since 2019, many are anticipating a crash is right around the corner. But those that know and study real estate understand it's a ride. It's not so much boom and bust, but more highs and lows, like this roller coaster. No doubt it's an attraction in high demand with steep cost, throwing many for the loop-de-loop. I don't care how many screen machines you've been on, we haven't seen anything in real estate quite like the past 5 years. So, where do we go from here? Well, let's strap on my latest analysis. Are you scared? Now, this video was inspired from an article I read on Bankrate asking if the housing market is ready to implode, which all depends on who you ask. I get it, I just don't see it happen. I lived and worked in Phoenix during the last big bust, one I don't care to relive, but am thankful for because it provides me perspective. In the game of life, everything is great until the moment it isn't. And a crash may be the only way for some to get into housing because over the last 5 years, it's been very tough. So let's go through some of the highlights to review the data and expand on this premise if warranted. From the outside looking in, blame it on the high rates and the even higher prices that are keeping many from owning a home. Affordability is enough of a challenge with one, nearly impossible dealing with both at the same time. Insiders say you snooze, you lose. But deep down, it's the fundamentals that are keeping this market ultra competitive. What's keeping prices extra high is the low supply and the demand that exceeds the supply. Meanwhile, interest rates have been on a tear for the last 2 years due to persistent spending, stimulus, and ultra low unemployment. Both sides admit this isn't going to last forever, but to say home prices are going to crash, define that, please. Joes are praying for rain, hoping that what goes high must also go low. And this article mentions a brief window in 2022 as things slowed. Prices pulled back just enough to get you to think about it, only to watch them go higher. Now, how can this be possible? In defense for higher prices, consider the following. Number one, the supply is too low for the demand. Even higher rates aren't enough to get this market to quit or buyers to quit on the market. Note this article was written just last month. It's not like it was done last year. And it mentions that the house payment is up over 150 buckaroos per month or a 7% payment increase, which is a huge amount when you consider the rising cost of insurance, taxes with your higher assessed value, and that's just housing. Now, interest rates will change and appear to have come off the top, but the payment is a function of these higher prices and thus higher loan amounts. The pros say this will change, meaning that the rate of appreciation will change. So don't plan on a correction anytime soon. And I wouldn't consider a slowdown in prices as prices reversing. Secondly, some of the pros say that the people have waited for rates to come down, which has proven a bad move so far. And not to rub it in, may only make the market more competitive as those waiting for rates to come down is now herd mentality. So the prices are up, the volume of sales is down, inventory is up slightly, but not enough to call it anything other than a seller's market anyhow. And to boot, the foreclosure rate is down over 22% since last year. I don't like those odds. But something's got to give. Pros and Joes agree the market doesn't make a whole lot of sense right now. But we've seen this movie before in 2007, and all good rides come to an end. So if not this year, maybe next. And when's your queue or your ticket in? Thirdly, experts say this isn't GFC 2.0 because of the following. You got a stronger homeowner with a better balance sheet. Homes have more equity. There's the lock-in effect. You got a strong job economy. Builders are behind, limited by these regulations. There's no risky subprime loans. And the loans that are out there, more of them are fixed and adjustable. As a result, crash is low odds. And I think everyone's tired of the Case-Shiller data pros and joes alike, but when things change, both are going to point fingers saying, "Ha, I told you so." I'd like to add that in the big picture, it is getting harder and harder to buy a home simply because wages haven't kept up with home prices over the last 5 years, over the last 30 years, and beyond. Because of the following. And the pros back this up based on the low inventory, builders not building enough, the demographics, millennials are now in their prime, lenders are lending and doing it responsibly, and we have a lack of distressed sales. But no matter what I look at and read as far as real estate goes, it's all going to end bad. So I had to dig a little deeper and share another article. Who can afford to sell in this market? And yes, who can afford to buy at these prices with the highest rates in the past 40 years? This will end when rates lose their G-force, right? And being in the business, it made sense that high rates impact affordability. But is there a correlation between rates moving higher and home prices moving even higher? Yes, there is, and here's the data to back it up. This chart does a wonderful job throwing light on the fact that using the last 30.5 years of history, that home prices increase when rates go lower, but also increase as rates go higher. So you scream when they go high and you shout when they go low. But how can this happen? You'd be amazed to learn that over 25 of the 30.5 years, prices go higher, and they spend 5.5 years going down. Now, I didn't believe it at first. Is this the end of discussion or only skin deep? But the writer brings up a very good point. The possibility of a lag effect. They say real estate changes, and when it does it slowly. Well, these guys are one step ahead. They tested the lag effect, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, and 3 years out to find any correlation. But after review throughout the 6-month and the 3-year period for no correlation. Now, they did find a slight negative correlation, but the results were somewhat similar. The data was almost the same, a little different, but the home prices went higher almost 25 of those 30 years. Now, there was a significant increase on the delayed results, mortgage rate growth, more in the price decline department as it went up from 6 months to 17 months, so an increase, let's call it, of about a year. Again, this is amazing data, stuff I just wasn't tuned into. Now, with the exception of the GFC, there is no historical evidence that rising rates lead to lower home values. So, is this a cycle or boom and bust? But these prices, Maddie, are inflated. There's a real lack of affordable homes, and with the average home price in the low 400,000, it's simply out of reach for most Americans. And yes, I agree. These home values are inflated due to inflation. Now, here are some more amazing stats. Homes, they're never affordable. And here's why. Rent keeps pace with inflation while home prices outperform inflation. Home prices rise faster than your incomes. And I quote, changes in housing prices tend to be influenced by inflation, but they don't perfectly follow overall inflation trends. Which makes sense. The U.S. has a growing population and real estate is in high demand because we all need a place to live. If you watch the CPI over the last 61 years, you'd see that the Consumer Price Index, the pulse of inflation, has risen nearly 900%. But when you compare that with housing, that's increased over 2,300%. Meanwhile, rent increased 892%, but kept up. So rents keep up with inflation, home prices don't. Now, this mentions that rents are regional, FYI. Now, on to home prices and incomes. And if incomes keep up with home prices, it's less painful. So for rounding, over the past 60 years, incomes have exceeded the price of rents, but well below the price of homes. So owning a home was, is, and never affordable. Renting is more likely. In response to the pandemic-inspired inflation, the Fed had to increase rates from 0 to 5%, which should decrease spending and encourage savings. Well, how did that work out? As rates rise, so does the proposed mortgage payment. Yes, 63% of Americans have one of those, thus making a move harder to afford. Mortgage rates have a huge impact on affordability, as if you bought your home in 2020, you could have paid $330,000, and based on the January 2020 rates, the payment would have been around $1,518 per month. Now, fast forward to July of 2023, the home price is up 30%, but the mortgage payment is up nearly 100%. I appreciate the article conclusion, and it asks who benefits from inflation and the housing market. Funny enough, the Super 63, those that have mortgages. And the reason they benefit is twofold. Their home increases faster than inflation, making it hard to lose value over time, while they're paying out on a monthly payment in future dollars that lose purchasing power over time. Let's discuss the concept of purchasing power. It is what you can buy with a specific unit of currency, such as a dollar or unit dollars like 100. Your purchasing power is impacted by a number of factors, including inflation. As the price of goods increase, you can effectively purchase less. That means the purchasing power of the dollar is lower. Swap out the dollar for any other currency, such as the peso or yen, and the same is true. So this issue isn't isolated to the United States. No matter where you are, if a government backs your currency, you can't opt out. You're committed to this ride, like it or not. Purchasing power is made up of a few things, which most of out of control or out of your control. So first is economic conditions. That would include the employment, GDP, consumer confidence, again, out of your control. Inflation, the rate of increase for goods and services, again, out of your control. Then there's interest rates, the cost of borrowing or the cost of credit versus income of savings, again, out of your control. Then you have exchange rates, the value of the dollar versus others, so that you can buy more or less foreign goods, either directly or indirectly, out of control. Then there is income, the one that you do have some control, and this impacts what you can buy and your quality of life. Regarding inflation, how do you know if you're keeping pace or falling behind? Well, there is this thing called the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. I'm not here to defend the metrics or say it is the measuring tool, but it is a barometer on inflation, and in some respects tracks food, housing, medical care, transportation. So the CPI tracks what it costs to buy these goods and services, and this article mentions movie tickets, but you could apply it to anything, roller coasters included. And yes, it's possible your purchasing power can change in both ways, but it's really a headwind you can't fight. There are ways to mitigate it. You could make more money, relocate to a lower cost part of the state or even country. On the inverse, you could increase your savings or investment or decrease spending, but as time passes, your purchasing power is going to expire. Think of yourself as a point guard. You're playing against the other team's defense, but you also have a shot clock of 24 seconds. Since purchasing power includes inflation, I want to expand on this article, which explains inflation as that hidden tax. It's colorless, tasteless, odorless, but it impacts everyone, just not everyone in the same fashion. And I thank the writer for mentioning the Big Mac Index, and it shows that inflation is subtle, and like a weed that grows, it's hard to stop once it starts. Inflation is expected, but there are secret agents of inflation. Think about your 24-second shot clock, right? And 5 defenders. But how well are you going to perform if we add another one? Make it 6 or 7 defenders. Your chance of scoring points on inflation can be reduced by these things, which we saw plenty of during the pandemic. So your inflation starting lineup includes Uncle Sam. Governments all over the world are designed to tax and spend, but they spend more than they take in, thus creating a deficit. Govies are inflationary machines. More they spend dilutes the power of the dollar and reduces your purchasing power. COVID-19 stimulus increased government spending and borrowing and masked the pain of the shutdown, but increased the cost of just about everything. Number 2, supply chain. So when businesses can't make things, the supply goes down and then the cost goes up. Inflationary. The 3-man cost push. Example, war. When there's a reduction in the supply of resources, this increases the cost, thus to inflationary. And number 4, those unforeseen events like the pandemic. Everyone was forced home, productivity was limited, and thus it was hard to forecast demand. Thus, the Fed lowered rates to zero, and with all this cheap money floating around, people that work from home decided to buy more home, leading to huge price increases in a very short time, thus inflationary. The pandemic was a perfect example of how inflation can unfold four ways. Looking at this chart, CPI is volatile, but in respect to the home price index, less volatile. There are periods in this chart which are flat, and the significance of this graphic is the 2008 to 13 period when home prices experienced a long-lasting bear market. It's important for context to expand this chart beyond the 1990s. Let's bring in the 70s. But it still shows that the National Home Price Index continues to climb even during the tough inflationary stresses experienced during the 1980s. So it is possible for home prices to go in three directions. But just because we've had a huge run doesn't automatically mean that this is revenge of 2008. It could be very reminiscent of the 1980s when there was actually worse inflation than we have now. Home values back then did just fine. Nevertheless, there are periods when home prices stall temporarily, say early 2022, in periods of huge decline, like during the GFC. Home prices went down 15 to 20% nationally. In some places, like the Copper State, when prices declined 40% from their highs. Eventually, an event will come along which will change the game, like the pandemic, but it's anyone's guess how the market is going to respond. For home prices to respond negatively, we need a few things. The market needs to change in terms of inventory and sentiment. And right now, what type of market is this? A buyer's market or a seller's market? By inventory standards, we should consider a 6-month supply as a balanced market or neutral. Right now, we're trending higher, hovering around 4 months, which is better for buyers, but fundamentally still favors sellers. During the GFC, inventory went up as high as 10 months, and we would be mistaken to refer 2009 to 2013 as the last best buyer's market. But that leads me to my next question. How long do these buyers and sellers markets actually last? Moreover, do they follow any type of cycle? Tommy Rains, a real estate specialist in Michigan, IDs the cycle in an article here written in 2019 before the pandemic and concludes, by historical standards, real estate follows an 18-year cycle. Interestingly, a buyer's market represents only 15 to 20% of the time. So the window of 2 to 3 years is really limited to the balance, the other 15 years which favor expansion. Further, the 15-year period breaks into two phases. First, the recovery phase, and then the expansion phase. Referencing the time the article was written, she predicts that based on historical measures, that would set up 2020 as the midpoint of the boom, putting the top in 2024. Also, the author reflects on the new construction market that the home building segment is still on its back in 2019. And to this day in 2024, it doesn't appear to be any better. Some economists say that we're currently underbuilt by 4 million homes, although we trimmed the gap by 1.45 completed homes in 2023. We haven't seen an extended buyer's market in 10 years' time, albeit may have had a short window when the pandemic first unfolded. It's still too early to see how the pandemic will impact this big picture cycle, and it's very possible that event could have extended this cycle beyond 20 years or perhaps reset it altogether. Send a thank you note for the low level of inventory. Attention, lock-in effect. They say 80% of the loans out there have less than a 5% rate, 60% less than 4%, and about 20% less than 3%. There's been a lot of discussion on the magical 5% rate as the trigger point to change the dynamics of the market. I'm skeptical of the 5% handle will do anything to change sentiment, as the lower for too long period has spoiled many mortgage holders. If lower rates alone aren't going to do it, how are we going to increase inventory? Well, there is good news regarding new homes and construction. From the builder's perspective, the elevated input increases have subsided. However, the unit cost of construction is still significantly higher in 2024 than it was prior to the pandemic. Regulations regarding the use and acquisition of land is still a significant challenge. Likewise, labor market still very tight, and interest rates are still a headwind. The combination is constricting supply. Despite the level of new inventory, it's at least double the inventory of existing homes. So I presume the future lower rate environment will help reduce inventory of new construction since the seller doesn't have to relocate. There's no lock-in effect for a new home. There's no one to displace. I'm going to keep my eye on the jobs and the employment figures and monitor the link to the behavior of real estate. An important detail regarding the last crash, if you will, from the 2008 era, if unemployment was higher than the national average before the recession, that was only exacerbated. If your local labor market was below the national average, it also got worse, but only by a marginal amount. Only the strong survive. Every market got weaker, but the weak markets got really weak. That should play into housing inventory, listing the sales price, and some other key metrics. This may be a good tool for you to follow in your local market. Sooner or later, something's got to give. But do you still believe in crashes? Or is this the next cycle when some get off to make room for the next players? It's going to be very hard to react to the next catastrophe in real time, but if that's what you're waiting for, maybe now's your time, and hopefully you have an iron stomach. You're going to need more than just the data. You're going to need conviction to buy real estate when others are contemplating buying a sofa. Don't sleep on interest rates, the job data, and most of all, the inventory levels to keep a pulse on your local market. The latest job data suggests the next move for the Fed is lower, but it could be for the wrong reasons. In case you haven't noticed, mortgage rates have already left the station and aren't waiting for Uncle Jerome to punch your ticket. It's only a matter of time until the next debacle, and after it escalates quickly, there's a high probability for the Fed to involve themselves in the markets. This interference is known as the Fed put, which they've done time and time again. It may take the market out of the market for the purposes to defend price stability and max employment. We've seen them intervene on markets 4 times since the GFC, and they're not afraid to use it at your expense. This may numb the pain, but understand the long-term impact when the government intervenes. It impacts almost everything. Most importantly, your purchasing power. Understand there are limitations to its effectiveness in the long term. Just look at what's going on right now in Japan. Fortunately for the US, the population is still growing, and we still are the #1 economy in the world. See? Maddie's always got your back. Until then, hold on to your undies.